So, just to begin, this question will be for Cynthia Matthews, Robert Singleton, Chris Crone, Martine, and Sandy. So the first question is, how should the university work with the city in regards to addressing the housing crisis and university expansion? So we can start with Cynthia.
Okay. Well, I think the main thing to do is to work with one another, and I have worked with the chancellor this past year on loosening up some of the state restrictions on how campus housing is provided, and also initiated a workforce housing committee jointly with the city, the county, and the local school districts. So that's an active participation. I think the other thing we need to do is to tackle the housing situation overall in the city. And certainly the housing crunch here affects students, it affects every single sector of our community. So I think the main thing is to look for opportunities to do more housing on campus, to be more flexible in the financing, because that's one of the real constraints, to be more flexible in the types of housing that can be provided on campus, and to look for opportunities off campus in the city where specific student housing can be provided, whether it's university funded or through a public-private partnership. So lots of avenues. I will say housing is complicated in the city. I think the other thing we can do, it doesn't really relate directly with interaction with the campus, but it's loosening up the accessory dwelling units. I think anything we can do to create more smaller units benefits the students.
Thank you. Next, Robert Singleton.
Can you tell me the question again?
Sure. How should the university work with the city in regards to addressing the housing crisis and university expansion?
Yeah, so I think the city should play an active role in working with the university to kind of site the best possible location to build some off-campus student housing and off-campus housing for service workers who currently work at the university and have to commute, usually from all the way in South County, to do so. I think that it's really expensive to build on campus. Some people have said it's 4 times more expensive. It could be up as 8 times more expensive depending on the site that you're looking at because of ADA compliance and debt restrictions for UC being able to lend. Also, UC Santa Cruz as an individual campus doesn't control how many students it gets allocated by the UC system-wide. So I think the city needs to take a proactive stance in working to assume that the city or that the university is going to continue to grow in line with their larger expansion plans, and that the most efficient way and most cost-effective way for us to build housing for students is probably going to be off-campus, where we can get around some of those really significant building constraints. And also, I'd prefer not to build out Porter Meadow and not to build out Upper Campus if we can, especially when we have some larger industrial places on the west side that would be well suited for some denser shared space living situations for some students. And working with the university and I think a private developer through a third-party nonprofit. So again, you get out of the financing restrictions, you get out of the development, the constraints in terms of ADA compliance. Working with a private developer who can finance the issue or can finance it partly with UC funding, you could provide for minimal parking impacts, you could provide minimal neighborhood impacts. The idea is to get existing students out of the single-family homes where they're very much crowded and you're also overcrowded on campus, but also to provide for future students. And then again, service workers I think are a priority because we want to cut down on the large-scale single-occupancy commuter trips that are happening.
Chris Crone?
Thank you for the question. I think we have to admit that students are profoundly affecting our community, and I think when they get involved, good things generally happen. And I think the history of Santa Cruz is that students have taken active participation in this community, and some of them even wind up on the city council and sometimes even become mayor. The mayor just referred to some offline conversation she might have had with the chancellor in working. The community has to be brought into this conversation, and it can't happen ad hoc and off. It's got to be a conversation with the community, with the students, and people have to be brought into it. And I think that something like the trailer park is wildly popular. That could be an easy transition housing on campus. We could set up several trailer parks. I know the chancellor did go to the regents and ask about some modular housing. I don't know how forceful he was, but that was, I think, if maybe the mayor would have gone with him or some council members, they could have made a much more impression on the UC regents. Because we are in a crisis, and we have to admit that. Santa Cruz is in a crisis. You go to the end of Felix Street, students are paying $3,000 for a two-bedroom apartment. You go to Schaefer Road, they're paying up to $3,500 for a two-bedroom apartment. This is outrageous, and you know the prices are fluctuating wildly. There's a lot of misinformation in town, so now you have a situation where people in the community there's friction between students and people in the community all competing for the same housing. I think the next city council has to look at a lot of different options, but has to work with the university on this issue and has to demand more from the university. We have to talk about, you know, rents, and we're hearing about rent control from all over, you know, knocking on doors. People, even homeowners, are saying, well, maybe we need some rent control. So we need to have that conversation as well.
Thank you. Martine?
Yeah. Excuse me. I think, you know, the housing situation in Santa Cruz is pressured, right, from all angles, from all aspects. So I think it's really important to look at it holistically in terms of where we're at for working families, to the role the university plays, to the students, to all kinds of folks that are living here in Santa Cruz. So for me, I think looking at the policies that are multi-pronged, to really look at how do we build those types of relationships with the university, with other types of developers, with all folks to come together to identify best solutions. So one of the things I had an opportunity to do is to meet and schedule an appointment with the government relations person here at the university, and to help me understand a little bit more about the complexities of building on campus. And so what it really opened the eyes for me is that one of the things that she said is the most important thing is that just being able to come together to work together. And it's kind of my philosophy as I've worked in this community for a really long time. It's ultimately about how do we collectively identify and look at what we can do as a community to work together to make an impact. And so that was sort of the first thing that I kind of really heard and took away from that conversation. And then second, really just looking at how do we look at some of the different policy options, whether it be collaborating to build off campus, how are we working and interfacing with the regents, what can be possible in terms of opportunities for more housing. I mean, I think for me, where I sort of landed with that conversation and just in general with the dynamic is that we all want to see more housing opportunities for students, and we value students. I used to come here, I lived in a huge home on the west side as well with a lot of folks and paid a lot of rent, and not only are students paying a lot of rent, but working people, retired people are paying a lot to live in Santa Cruz. So I think we just need to look at it in a way that's holistically, and so we can collectively come up with a solution for all of us that are being impacted by the housing issue in the community.
So I have a follow-up on that, so it'll be 1 minute. So what exactly do you propose for those?
You know, for housing in general, I mean, we could look at ADU policy, you know, looking at how do we incentivize folks, homeowners to build ADU. We could look at rezoning some of the areas in our community, or look at where we could potentially have development, like on the west side and those types of areas. I think ultimately it's looking at how do we, how do we come together to identify what we can do in the community. And I think we have a higher demand than we do a supply. So what does it mean in terms of development and growth in a way that's going to be thoughtful and sustainable and not have as much of an impact on neighborhoods? I think you can look at partnerships like we have with Habitat for Humanity, where we're incentivizing those that are aging on their property to build ADUs, to rent those out so that they have their home to rent out to ideally families or whoever, but having an opportunity to have more kind of housing options. I think ultimately it's looking at it collectively. There's also the opportunity for employer-assisted housing, for housing on campus. I think for us I work at the County Office of Education, so there could be the potential for teacher housing. I just think it has to be multi-pronged.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sandy Brown is last one.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here. So I think we all know what the challenges are, and so I'm not going to continue to repeat those. But I do want to say that in the time that I've spent on this campaign, walking and talking with students and people in our community, staff, and professors, faculty, lots of people who are affiliated with this university, I have not talked to one student or staff member who thinks that they have stability and the ability to continue to live in this town. And that to me is a huge issue of concern. I think there are lots of things that the city can do to negotiate better with the university. I think we've had a lot of missed opportunities with some of my colleagues here have suggested we can build some housing off campus on the west side corridor, which isn't yet part of the corridor plan, but could and should be. And I think, we're not building student housing, and the university is admitting more and more students. So the city has a larger role to play negotiating and demanding that the university house students, and they do it in an affordable way. I was shocked to hear that students on campus pay $3,000 a month just to be able to live in this town. And so I want to see a city council that does better in navigating that with the university, and saying we hope and we hope the university will do better isn't enough. The city has some leverage, and I have lots of ideas about how to use that leverage.
Thank you. Just one follow-up on that. You said that there's been a lot of missed opportunities, and that the university and the city should negotiate better, or in that way. So what does that look like? How would the city go about negotiating with the university better?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways. One is around access to water on campus, and I'm not saying I want to shut off the water to the students. I'm saying the university needs to accept the fact that the city has some role to play in the decisions it makes. And the missed opportunities on that part of the question, I'm just going to be really blunt and say, we got a big ugly hotel on the west side, and that could have been student housing. It could have been created more housing and been more affordable.
Thank you. And then my second student question is for all of the people that already talked. This will be for you as well. Given the university's long-range development plan of accepting over 19,000 students by 2020, how do you plan to minimize the impacts this will have on the environment, such as water usage, traffic, and public transit congestion? So some of you already mentioned on this, but to reiterate, Martine, we can start with you.
Sure. I think you have to, for transportation, it's incentivizing people not to have cars or to be able to access public transportation as best as possible to sort of be able to monitor and sort of mitigate that. So I think that's one of the things that I've heard is, and I know that the university has already moved in that direction, is making it really expensive to have a car on campus. So, there's ways to but it's also really relying on our public transportation system. Sorry, the other aspects of the question were?
So how do you plan to minimize environmental effects such as water usage,
Right.
traffic, public transit congestion?
Sure. I was curious about the water usage thing, and so it was really interesting when I met with this person to really understand. And what she was able to share with me is that actually the university has been really amazing at being able to conserve more water. And at this time, it says that only from her information that she provided me that the university is using only 6% of the city's water use. So it was really interesting for me to hear about what they've been able to do here at the university to already start moving in that direction. And I know they have aspirations to continue on that sustainability plan. And then in terms of the housing, I think just exactly what we were talking about. I think it's recognizing that we are having an increase of population density as similar communities along the coast of both the east and west coast of our country. And so it's really important to look at how do we be holistic, how do we be sustainable, and look at how do we partner to accommodate that. And also for me, I value, the university is a part of Santa Cruz, so it's really looking at how do we value each other as partners who are complementary to our community and our city.
Thank you. Cynthia Matthews.
I think it's important to start by acknowledging that the city does not control really anything that the university does per se. The university regents are an independent entity in the state of California, and the city doesn't govern their zoning. They have great independence. As you all know as students, things come down, and you can respond, you can do your best, but that's a given for the city of Santa Cruz. So people have mentioned negotiating versus forcing, and those are two different things, or suing. So in terms of university growth, it is going to happen. The question is, how do we respond as a community? This community will grow, it will evolve, and it does provide opportunity to the students of California. That is a good thing. So I will say I was on the council and involved during the last long-range development plan. And at that point, the university had a plan to grow to a certain number. The city was very concerned because even in the environmental impact report and study for that growth, the city felt they did not acknowledge the university's impact on water, on housing, and transportation. So the city sued, and the university suing the city suing the university. That is a big time sink of money and doesn't necessarily get you what you want. So we engage in a long-term, a year-long mediation process between the city of Santa Cruz and the university, number of people on both sides. It was a long, arduous, real-life experience in putting your issues on the board and resolving them. And what came out of that was a negotiated settlement on water consumption conservation on campus. That resulted, as Martine said, in a dramatic drop in just a couple years in university water consumption, to the fact that it can now achieve its projected growth without exceeding the water consumption of just 5 years ago. We negotiated a settlement on transportation, and Martine mentioned a couple of strategies, but I think you know on campus, it is an intense and really excellent transportation program, TAPS, to reduce single occupancy vehicles, alternative use, and so no one says we've arrived. No one says we can't do better, but it is a serious effort, and it has reduced single occupancy trips on campus from what they were 5 years ago. The other thing, well, I mentioned water, transportation, housing. We did negotiate a settlement that the university would house on campus about 2/3 of its new students. Now, it's still a horrible challenge, but that's more than any other campus does currently. So I think the main thing is, yes, you have to communicate with one another. The city cannot in itself control what the regions decide to do, but by actively cooperating, and we meet monthly, the city meets monthly with the university personnel to see how they're doing. It's really important to communicate, to jointly try and find solutions, and that's where we can make progress.
Thank you. Robert Singleton?
Well, yeah, I talked about it a lot in my first answer in terms of prioritizing new growth, if I could, off campus, because it's more efficient, it's better for the environment, and has the least impact on our neighborhoods. So in terms of what the best solution moving forward is, I think I stand behind that. And to talk a little bit more about UC's expansion, again, UC is like the fourth branch of government in California. I mean, the reason why they were written into the California Constitution as they are is to be academically independent from the political system as much as possible. So that's been, it's really hard for a city of 60,000 people who signed pretty much a unilateral agreement when the UC first came here to just try and exert some legal leverage over them, especially given the context of like the individual campus doesn't control a lot of what it gets handed down for the system wide. I think the long-range development plan, is going to be the key renegotiating point, because that's going to come up in 2020 at the end of this upcoming council's term. So it's going to be really important whoever we have on there. I think it's really important to acknowledge the partnership with UC, because working against each other, we both waste money and resources and nothing gets done. But in working in partnership, as Cynthia demonstrated, we've been able to accomplish a lot of things. And I think that if they've adequately addressed their water use above and beyond the fact to the point where they've actually reduced their water use just by adding students, using water as kind of a negotiating point of leverage doesn't seem like an ethical way to do it to me, because again, they've addressed that issue. So withholding a basic need resource to try and get something out of someone, a larger party who probably could beat you in court if they wanted to press the issue anyways, doesn't seem like the most pragmatic strategy for me.
Thank you. Chris Grun?
First, I just want to say that I've been an educator my whole really adult life, and have worked in schools, high schools. I work here on campus. I'm the internship coordinator for environmental studies. I've had over 5,000 interns through my program. So I feel like I've heard their stories, and I think that you all live it here. You're hearing a lot of public relations sound bites. and it's, you meet with a government relations person, her name is Donna Blitzer. It does not mean that you run out and have, cite her statistics. It's kind of like a press release. It's kind of like printing a press release in the newspaper without going through the steps of ferreting out what the real information is. I think that politics is a lot about negotiation. And if you're not unwilling to sit at a table, the city council can't make necessarily laws for the university, but you sit down at the table and you negotiate with them as a good neighbor. The university and the city frequently have divergent interests. It's not the same thing. And you need to take it like that. Having a buddy-buddy relationship with the university doesn't work because, the university always wins, in my experience, if you have this buddy-buddy relationship. It doesn't mean you have a caustic relationship. It means you have one of firm negotiation, and you lay on the table what is necessary, what the needs are of the community in those negotiations. For example, the LRDP, lots of parts of that were a disaster in terms of there was this thing called the rental inspection ordinance that actually took a lot of units out of commission in this town. And I believe it happened at a time when we had a recession and the university was worried about occupying all of their own dorm spaces on campus. And so they were looking at places of how can we make sure students stay on campus. Now students get kicked off after 1 year. Even though I keep hearing that they're guaranteed 2 years, they tell me 1 year. So I think the next council, nobody's turning off water on students. You're going to hear that. That's a myth. Nobody's talking about turning off water on students. We're talking about development, responsible development, colleges 11 and 12 in upper campus. Many of us would consider that not responsible development.
Thank you. Last one, Sandy.
So I think it's clear that Santa Cruz, the whole community overall, is a good water conservation community. And students are some of the best conservers of water. And so I don't talk about water to suggest that, if students are using less water than their fair share or their per capita share, that we should just accept that. I'm saying it is a point of leverage for the city when we have very little leverage, and other people have spoken about this. We have very little leverage about the decisions the university makes. It is a point of leverage, and it doesn't mean that students are bad because they're using too much water or there's too many students. It means the city has some say in the way the university expands. And and what Chris said, I could repeat it, but I just think that it's time to talk with the university about their expansion plans in a more proactive way.